Hey y'all, how's it going? My name is Brooke and this is Seed to Plate channel, and today we're talking about all the different ways that you can start a garden. Hey y'all, so if you are a regular viewer of this channel, you're probably wondering why I'm making this video. This is Seed to Plate, my name is Brooke. I've been gardening for 5 or 6 years now, about 3 years on a really big scale. Not really big, but big for an urban suburban space. And I made a video last May about my story with celiac disease, and this very kind woman emailed me asking me a few questions, and in that she said she actually was getting interested in starting a garden, and she straight up just said, how do I start a garden? And I realized that that was a good question, and I've been gardening for long enough now to where that wasn't something I considered when I put out gardening content. Was like, maybe somebody's watching my videos thinking to themselves, like, how do I even get started with this? So today we're going to talk about all the ways that you can start a garden, things to consider, things to think about. It's going to be a long but a very good conversation. So grab a beverage, sit down, get comfortable, because we're going all the way back to basics today. Okay guys, so first things first. You've decided it's January 2022. This is the year I want to have a garden. This is the year I want to start a garden or start gardening. The very first thing I want you to ask yourself when thinking about starting a garden is, how committed do you want to be to your garden? And this isn't like a morality or a values question, right? The answer to this question has no implications about if you're a good gardener. It's really just a consideration of how much time and resources do you actually have. How much of your time do you want this hobby to take up, and how committed are you to making it work? And I think this goes back to, what are your goals, what are your motivations, things like that. Because if you don't have a why, and if you don't have a why, you can't evaluate your commitment to the why, and it's really easy to get frustrated at that point. So first things first, ask yourself how committed you want to be. I'm the treasurer of my community garden. I have a community garden plot. It's a 10-foot by 20-foot plot. And at my, I also have backyard gardens, but at my community garden, I am the one that manages who has which plot, how many plots are full, how many plots are empty. And I can tell you only about 1 in 5 new gardeners actually sticks with us for a year. And that could be for a litany of factors, but a lot of those people just decided they wanted to start gardening without really evaluating the time, energy, effort it was going to take. And then they fell off and they disappeared and we never heard from them again. And then we turned over their plot to somebody else. So that's really only 20% of people who commit and they pay for the garden for the year, and then they just disappear and we never see them again. So based on that, when I tour new people around the garden that are interested, I really tell them, I say, I'm actually not going to give you a plot for 24 to 48 hours. Follow up with me via email, think about it, consider it. Here's all these list of considerations, and then come back to me and tell me if you want a plot. So evaluating that level of commitment to your garden or your gardening journey is really, really important. And if that means you start small, start small. It's okay. I started small. I started being really interested in growing plants, and I probably had my first little garden 5 years ago in the backyard of my apartment. I had like a little fenced in backyard in my apartment complex, and me and my mom landscaped it, and we planted a few things. I think I only ever got like one good harvest out of it because I didn't get enough sunlight and I didn't have a hose, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you know, it's just one of these things where your commitment to any hobby is important, but especially with gardening, you know, having your why and then evaluating your commitment to the why is a really important part. I encourage you, if this is your first gardening season, to start small. Start with just some pots or some grow bags. Maybe you're the type of person that just goes balls to the wall and goes all in, and that's cool too. But I would advise you to start small. because it gets you excited, you get to learn, and if you have a failure, it's not gonna be emotionally crushing. Okay, you're ready. You say, I'm committed, I wanna start a garden. Next, you need to evaluate 3 things: sun, your actual amount of space you have, and water access. The first and arguably most important thing is to evaluate your space, right? How much actual space do you have to grow? If you're just growing on an apartment balcony, I have grown in pots, I've grown with like window boxes that you just like hang over the balcony. I've also seen people grow in vertical towers like this green stock. That is a green stock vertical planter. And the way it works is it is a tiered system. You put water in the top and then it flows down. And I have seen people plant these things up like crazy. And so evaluating your space is important. If you have small space, you can definitely still garden. It just might look a little different than these big sprawling beds that you see all over Instagram and YouTube. But green stock, so cool. So after you've evaluated your space, how much actual space you want to take up with your garden, the next thing to think about is the amount of sun that space gets. That is, I learned the hard way that is like more essential than you really know. So my backyard garden, which is what I'm looking at right now, I actually can't really grow a fall garden here because when the earth moves and the sun is lower in the skyline, my backyard neighbor's trees that are extremely tall and not very well trimmed, it blocks all of my sun. However, in the spring, when the sun is more overhead, I have just enough sun to have a very big green lush garden. So sometimes that can be a really fine line, and the amount of sun that you get is vitally important to the success of your plants. The next thing is access to water. So access to water is going to be super important, right? If you don't have easy access to water, it's going to get really frustrating trying to take care of your garden. So just for example, that apartment backyard garden that I was talking to you guys about a minute ago, I had no hose. I had no way to get water. I would literally take a bucket and dump bucketfuls of water from my bathtub onto the garden to try and keep it alive. And lo and behold, that didn't last very long. I got really frustrated and I let most of the garden die because when it got hot, it was just so much work. And so thinking about where your hoses are and even an irrigation setup, do you want to irrigate with like a drip line system or soaker hoses? Do you want to hand water every day? I'm kind of at the point this year with my backyard garden, I'm debating doing some soaker hoses just because it's a lot of work to water this amount of space every day. So if you're an apartment dweller, or even if you're in a rental house, or even just a house that you own, but you don't feel like, transforming your backyard, go look up your local community gardens. That was my first place having enough space to actually grow everything that I wanted to grow, was my community garden that I still have. Despite having a backyard garden space, I keep that space as like a very sentimental thing. So I'm gonna leave a card up here so you guys can see my community garden in Austin, Texas. A lot of community gardens, they're not super savvy, like on the technical side. You'll probably have to email somebody. There'll have to be a little bit of back and forth. I think we live in a very technical world, so we're used to just pushing a few buttons and having whatever we want. That's not the case with community gardens. There's a lot of correspondence. I still run into people all the time who think that my community garden is like some closed off legacy like managed space, and it's not at all. We have tons of open plots. So just get courageous, reach out to your community garden and see if they have an open plot available. Now, if you have decided that you want to transform your backyard, you're gonna need at least 6, preferably 8 hours of sunlight, if not more, for everything to grow the way that it needs to. So when I was kind of evaluating this space to see if I wanted to build a garden back in this backyard, I noted what time the sun was actually shining on the piece of ground that I wanted to plant on, and I noted when it was shaded. And when we moved in, it was late summer, so this space was getting a lot of sun. Didn't know about the whole sun situation at that point. Next thing to consider when you're thinking about your space is, do you actually have space for a raised bed? Do you have space, or should you try and use some grow bags? You know, really making your garden fit into your space is the most important part. So I'm going to put up a couple of pictures of the balcony planters that I had. Those were awesome for fresh herbs that we used all the time. And then also I showed you the vertical planter, but let's also look at some grow bags. Grow bags are going to be pretty cheap fabric pots that you fill with soil. And the drawback that you're going to have with grow bags is they do need to be watered a little bit more often, purely because, you know, they have more oxygen. So I have been growing with grow bags for just about a year, and I really like it. I've grown all kinds of things inside of them. Those are really big ones. You can get much smaller ones. I was growing full size, like 8-foot indeterminate tomatoes in those grow bags, which is why they needed to be so big. So if you're looking to get started somewhat cheaply, grow bags are an awesome consideration. The thing to think about with grow bags though is they're not going to have the microbiome that the ground is going to have. So you're probably going to need to fertilize more. You're probably going to need to water a little bit more, but it is a really cost-effective way to get started with gardening. Albeit, I personally don't think it's the prettiest. But hey, you know what? We all start somewhere. The other thing that I've seen people do is grow in 5-gallon buckets or even just plastic pots. You can definitely do that if you do the whole 5-gallon bucket route, or even a plastic pot from like the hardware store like Home Depot. Make sure there's holes drilled into it. I made that mistake only one time. Only once. Now that we're at the point where you say, okay, Brooke, I have the space, I got the sun, I got the water access. What's next? Next, in this process of thinking about your garden, is evaluating the soil that you have, the native soil. This is a crucially important part of gardening. So you can have a soil test done through your local agriculture extension office. They may or may not require payment for it, but you can have a soil test done, and then they will tell you what the makeup of the soil is, so you know what you need to add in order to get that soil to a place that is suitable for growing vegetables. Then, if you want to do a soil test, I will give you full disclosure, I've never done a soil test. I've kind of just always winged it, but I also go by the no-till method, which we'll talk about here in a minute. If you get a soil test and it's determined that your soil is pretty poor for vegetable growing, you can either create raised beds upon which you add layers of soil that are going to be good for growing plants. And the other thing to consider with raised beds is physical accessibility. So I actually have a couple different types of raised beds, which should be no surprise to you at this point. These are raised beds that I built out of wood from the store, and then I have been building up the soil. And so these are about 6-inch planks. They are weather treated wood, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But I built these. So this is a 4x8. I have 2 4x8s, and then I have a 4x4. And these were all built on a no-till method, which again, we'll get to in a minute. But this is just regular old wood from the hardware store. Now, this beautiful thing I really like. This is a Vego Garden bed, and I did a video where I assembled this. Vego Garden actually sent this to me for free so that I could test it out, and I really love it so far. It can be a little expensive to fill, however, something that's taller is going to be way easier on your back and just overall kind of handling the garden and dealing with it. The last garden bed I built is this one. So this one is just with some pavers that my neighbor was actually getting rid of, and so I took them and outlined my bed. But this was really just, these are probably, I don't know, maybe 4 inches tall. It's really not that big. This garden, which by far has been my most productive, is pretty much just in the ground, again, established using a no-till method. That to be said, raised beds are really cool, really good way to get started gardening. However, they can be a little bit more expensive to actually get started because you're having to buy the materials to outline the bed, or you're buying a pre-made bed and a kit, and then you have to fill it, and it's tall, which there's cheap ways to do that, but you're just going to incur a little bit more expense when you decide to do some raised beds. So even if you do raised beds, I recommend starting small. My first fall here, I just built the 3 beds, and then the next spring I had the bed with the pavers, And then actually the next fall, I have the taller raised bed. So I've kind of added beds one at a time, or one grouping at a time. I haven't actually built them all at once. Okay, so now you've evaluated your soil, you know what kind of garden you want to build. Next, you have to actually get that garden established, right? So I've said it a couple times so far. There's till and there's no-till. And this can be a fairly hot topic in the gardening world and in the agriculture world, honestly. There's a Netflix documentary that talks about, it's called Kiss the Ground, talks about tilling and environmental impacts and soil science. Really a lot of good scientific things to know about plants and gardening. Now, everybody has a different opinion based on the science, right? I tend to operate on a no-till method or a modified no-till method. So every garden that you've seen in this backyard was established using a no-till method. Now what that means is you're actually not disturbing the soil. You're actually not tilling up the soil to get rid of all the grass and all the weeds and loosen it, right? Because when you do that, you really disrupt the microbiome of the soil. And so what you do is you lay down some cardboard boxes, and then you lay down a good chunk of like compost and organic materials. I also mulch heavily because I live in a hot state. And so adding up all of those things, what's going to happen is you're actually going to choke out the weeds or the grass that you're growing on by it not having any light. And as the cardboard actually disintegrates and decomposes, the soil just kind of all becomes one entity that you're growing in. Now, the biggest thing that I found when I first established my gardens was that I did not break through the cardboard when I put in transplants, and so the roots didn't have really anywhere to go. And so I learned, and when I did my second one, the one with the pavers, I actually established the bed, and I did the cardboard, and I did everything, and I let that sit for about a month and a half before I actually put any plants in the ground to give it time for the cardboard to kill off the weeds and for it to kind of all become one homogeneous mixture. A vocab word for the day, homogeneous. So using that no-till method, I've had a ton of success in. However, we also have pretty good native soil. My community garden used to be a fish hatchery, so it's very fertile. And my backyard really just has done pretty well for me so far. The types of compost that I added on top of the cardboard were composted cow manure and just good old bagged compost, and then natural undyed cedar mulch on top. And that has been very successful for me. I also use just about the same principles at my community plot. Both spaces, I will aerate the ground with a pitchfork, so I'll stick a pitchfork down and kind of move the dirt a little bit, but I don't lift it up and out. And so I think no-till works better in some areas than in others. Tilling also has its perks. People will also till once and then never till again. There's tons of different resources and ways to kind of go about the till or no-till situation. And you also have to evaluate too, the whole no-tilling thing. It's a great movement, and I'm super supportive, obviously, because I do it and I find a ton of success with it. But also, really we need big corporations to start tackling the till situation. It's not necessarily on the backs of backyard gardeners. That's what I'll say about that. So the next thing, and I kind of touched on this, is what are you amending your beds with? Now, when we say amending the beds, we mean amending the things that the soil doesn't have, right? So maybe your soil is low in nitrogen, maybe it's phosphorus, maybe your soil is low in calcium. These are all really important components for your plants to properly grow. And some plants need more things than others. Tomatoes tend to do well with a lot of nitrogen, which is why one of my favorite things to grow is tomatoes. And so I typically use a high nitrogen amendment, such as composted cow manure. I'm growing onions right now. Onions need phosphorus, and so bone meal is really high in phosphorus. Now, I usually go by organic growing methods. There are some things I don't do that may not be considered organic, but for the most part, I try and follow organic gardening methods. And so I always go for the more natural amendments as opposed to using fertilizer. Using fertilizer is not my first choice unless it's an organic fertilizer or unless it's just like really good rich compost. But sometimes you need a little fertilizer, and that's okay. So this is where a soil test can be super helpful, because it's going to tell you exactly what your soil is lacking so that you can go in and give your soil what it needs. I just don't have patience. So I've never done a soil test, but everything I've done has worked well so far. I really just try and go for a very balanced approach when I think about amending, or I try and go for what I know my plants are going to need. So in terms of establishing a bed, right, you either have your raised beds or you have an in-ground garden, which is still going to need some kind of barrier. But they have different approaches. So like I said, let's touch on treated versus untreated wood. There's a lot of information out there from way back in the day about pressure treated wood and how the chemicals will leach into the soil and it'll hurt you and your plants if you eat the fruit from the vegetables and all this stuff. I did a lot of my own research, and I encourage you to do the same. I built these beds when wood was pretty expensive in like 2020. And so from the research I did, I wasn't too concerned about the chemicals leaching out into my soil and therefore my vegetable plants and therefore the fruit and therefore me. Wasn't a huge concern for me. I think there's a lot of fear-mongering article headlines out there without actually having the research to back it up. And so make sure you actually read some peer-reviewed scientific studies about this stuff. I use pressure-treated wood. I don't see a problem with that. And my beds have held up very well now for a couple of years. Sometimes certain woods will hold up better than other woods. Generally, if you're using wood, it's going to have to be replaced after 5, 6, 7 years. And so choose your materials wisely. The untreated wood, like if I were to have built these with like natural undyed cedar planks, you'd be looking at like $1,000 garden build. And your girl don't have that kind of money, honey. Obviously, wood is kind of a no-brainer in terms of edging out your garden. You can use brick pavers. You can just use straight up bricks. There's some people at my community garden who don't do anything. They just edge it with a shovel to keep the grass out. Now, at my community garden, I actually use cinder blocks. And I got this idea a couple of years ago. And cinder blocks are cheap. I'll give them that. And I really wanted to use the holes in the cinder blocks to plant herbs and flowers and different things like that. So that was really the motivation behind the whole cinder block situation. Here's what I'll say. Cinder blocks are very heavy. They're very annoying to transport because you gotta load them in and then you gotta load them out and then you gotta place them. And we wanted to make sure that we were doing it right, so we added some rock and we dug out where the cinder blocks were gonna go. So the cinder blocks were very hard to move around. And if this was gonna be at a space that was more permanent, right, like a house that I owned, I'd probably be way more excited about it. But the thing with the community garden is you have to remove whatever you bring in. And so someday when I leave the community garden, I'm gonna have to haul all those freaking cinder blocks right back out. So I think cinder blocks are a good option. I've never had issues with the cement overheating and killing stuff. I've actually had a ton of success. That was kind of something that people brought up when I told them I was doing cinder blocks, was just the radiant heat. I find that it actually works really, really well. And then of course you have your metal raised beds that you can order and put together. I've never really seen anything bad about metal raised beds in terms of like leaching chemicals or falling apart or anything like that. The biggest thing with metal raised beds is they're going to be more expensive to fill. So I'm going to leave a link down below so you can watch my Vego garden assembly video if you do choose to go the raised bed route. Getting creative about filling it is going to be a very good key for you. So let's touch on weeds and weeding your garden, because I think this is something that, as a gardener, I'm just going to tell you right now, no matter what method you use to establish your garden, you are never going to get away from weeding. There is no such thing as a weed-free garden. It doesn't exist. So just let go of that dream right now. I will say with my no-till gardens that I established using the cardboard that are in my backyard, I have severely less weeds here. At my community plot, there's a lot of other factors I can't control, right? If a plot around me gets overgrown and the weed seeds blow in, which happens all the time, I have a much harder time controlling that environment. And so I have a lot of weeds in my community garden plot. It's just kind of the name of the game, to be honest with you. And again, a lot of factors that I can't control. I have weeds here in this garden. They are just severely less aggressive because there's a fence around our backyard, and so the weeds can't blow in as much. And also it's the way I established it. So the consideration with weeding is just if you have a border around your garden, you're gonna have less weeds. If you dig out a little trench around your garden and before you establish it, you're gonna have less weeds. There are things that you can do to mitigate the weeds, but you're never gonna have a completely weed-free garden. So it's just not gonna happen. Things that can help with weeds are mulch. So I'm a big mulch advocate. Like big mulch advocate, probably because I live in Central Texas. It's very hot here in the spring and summer gardening season, and therefore we need water conservation efforts. And one of the biggest water conservation efforts you can make is mulch. Undyed native mulch. I should caveat that. You do not want to use dyed mulch. They put so many chemicals in that mulch. Don't do it. It looks weird, it smells weird. If it looks weird and it smells weird and it doesn't look natural or smell natural, I generally in life stay away from those things. Like including like, I don't even use like perfume. Nope. I just want to smell like me. We good. So when really thinking about water conservation and weeding, I heavily advise using mulch. I use native, again, I live in Texas. Cedar is very abundant here. I get cedar mulch, and when I first establish a bed, I lay down at least 2 inches of mulch over whatever compost and amendments I've already used. And just to maintain the mulch, I probably add another like inch every time I turn over a bed. So mulching is super, super duper important. That is something that will help your weeds. Again, you're never gonna have a weed-free garden, but mulching will help. And some other types of mulch, one of them, wood chips are another really good one. I have seen a lot of people use straw mulch. I did that one time and ended up with a lot more weed seeds. So if you don't get the right straw mulch, you can end up with a lot more little grass that's gonna pop up everywhere. And you've now just invited more weeds into your life. So this was a lot of things to think about, but to kind of boil it down, I need you to ask yourself how committed you want to be and use that as a determination of how you want to start. Maybe you just start with like one little tomato plant or one little pepper plant, or maybe just some plants in pots, or maybe a vertical planter. Maybe you want to start like a garden bed, you know, then I want you to think about your space and your sun and your access to water and really kind of evaluate all of those things and take them into consideration. Maybe you need to look for a community garden. That's cool too. And then once you evaluate all of those things, you really think about your soil, think about all the things we talked about, and then think about your method of establishing your garden. And I know this is a lot of things to think about and consider, but I'm telling you right now, as somebody who's only been gardening for 5 years, I've had the success that I've had because I evaluate and I research and I learn before I jump in and start doing things. And if all else fails and you're still confused, go to your local garden center. And I'm not talking about Home Depot, I'm talking about like your local garden nursery, and just talk to them and ask them what works in your area, because every area is going to be super different. Once you get all of these things figured out and you're like, where do I start this? You probably want to know how to plan out your garden and what to plant. And I will leave a list of videos below on other videos I've created of how to plan out an established garden space, what I'm excited about planting, and kind of how to think about your consumption of what you want to plant. And yeah, gardening is exciting, guys. And if you're watching this video and you're trying to figure out how to start a garden for the first time, or maybe you're just even considering some different ways of gardening and you're already an established gardener, I'm excited for you, and I wish you all the gardening success and lots of abundance. So thanks so much for watching. Happy gardening, and we'll see you next time. yappy little dog ruins like 50% of my YouTube videos.